Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. I finally made this channel public, so I can say for the first time, if you've been enjoying these videos, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. This video is going to be about the books that I read for the month of September. This month, I just happened to read only books by female Asians or Asian Americans. The first book that I'm going to talk about is called The Vegetarian by Han Kang, who is from South Korea. And I read this with my book club. This book originally came out in 2007, but it was only translated into English by Deborah Smith in 2015. So I'm obviously reading the English translation because I don't speak Korean. I've been wanting to read this book for a really long time. I actually bought it paperback several years ago, but just now finally got around to it. I feel like the title of this book is really misleading. It is about a woman who she refuses any form of sustenance. And so she's the vegetarian, but it's not really a story about becoming vegetarian or even too much of a commentary on the environment or even our relationship with the environment that much. Instead, it's really about the patriarchal society that Korean women live in and all women live in, and kind of the horror and the violence of everyday life and how that can turn into something really, really violent and terrifying if you open your eyes up to it. I really don't want to give too much away. I think that this month is the first time where most of my books, I don't want to give away too much of the plot because I read all fiction stories, but it's in 3 parts, and I read that actually each of these parts came out separately in Korea, but then when they were putting it into a novel form, they made it individual chapters. So the first chapter is called The Vegetarian, and it's told from the point of view of the woman who's denying sustenance's husband. The second chapter is called Mongolian Mark, and I really don't want to say too much about that because the way that is introduced or the way that it's revealed through the story, I think is extremely powerful. When I read Mongolian Mark, I didn't know what that was, but I didn't even want to Google it because the storytelling and the way that it was being described was so powerful, so I just wanted it to play up in my mind. And then the last chapter is called Flaming Trees. So in the second chapter, you shift perspective away from the husband to the vegetarian's sister's husband. So the first 2 sections are told through the viewpoint of men, Korean men. And then the last chapter, Flaming Trees, is through the point of view of the vegetarian sister. Without giving away any plot points, I kind of just wanted to cover some of the themes that I took away from it. I used to be / still am very obsessed with existentialism, and one of the key tenets or the key ideas of existentialism is that life is so absurd that the only rational choice when you really open your eyes up to the absurdity and the irrationality of life is to commit suicide, which is an idea from Camus. But I think when you think about existentialism as a response to Enlightenment thinkers or very rational philosophers, I think the main thrust there is that there's really no reason or fate or logic behind humanity, and it's all just an absurd, chaotic mess. And part of why I think this is a very existential novel is I think it's almost like feminist existential, because I think a lot of what's described really opens your eyes up to 2 worlds. One world where you live your everyday normal life and you think that this is how things should be. Society is just chugging along, nothing to see here. And everyone plays their role and their part in society. And then the other world, which I think is a truer, more raw world, which is a very absurd and chaotic and violent world, is one that is perhaps more real. And I think that to me feels very existential. I don't know if it's because of my prior bias and obsession. I'm sure there is an existentialist take on this book, and there's also a non-existentialist take, but that's definitely a big theme that I picked up on personally. A lot around like being a woman in Korean society as being inherently painful and absurd and violent. And I think there's also a lot of strong imagery around being force-fed certain things, like being dictated by the patriarchy or traditional society to behave a certain way as a woman in that culture. And then there's definitely parallels to the whole storyline of the vegetarian refusing food. I will say, I don't know if there are trigger warnings for books yet, but there was a lot of really graphic and heavy stuff in here, both I would say around like eating disorders and food, but also like just sexual violence. So anyway, without giving away too much, I feel like this was a very actually I wrote a note that in the back that it was kind of a mix of The Bell Jar and The Ring. So The Bell Jar is Sylvia Plath's somewhat autobiographical novel, and then The Ring is like the English version of Ringu, which is a Japanese horror film. The Ring was one of my favorite like scary movies growing up. So that maybe gives you a taste of like the tones, the overtones of this book. I will say though, even though there's not a heavily overt message around becoming a vegetarian or anything like that, there is definitely a lot of thematic material around animalistic urges, I guess, and imagery around like a lot of the horror imagery or like the kind of violent things that happen also make you question how we treat each other as humans versus how we treat animals, and also the connection between the world and the forests and the trees and the mountains and plants and the life that they live and how they're life-giving versus how humans have constructed our society, I think. Just one quote that I think really reads as existentialist comes from the point of view of the vegetarian sister, and it comes towards the end where she's really having this kind of existentialist awakening, in my personal opinion, in the sense that there's that break where you realize how absurd life is, and then what existentialists believe is then you have the radical freedom to build your own identity and your life how you want to. But anyway, the quote is, "Opposite the platform was a row of temporary buildings, their steel structures now decaying, and wild grasses straggling up between the sleepers on the edges over which no trains passed. The feeling that she had never really lived in this world caught her by surprise. It was a fact. She had never lived. Even as a child, as far back as she could remember, she had done nothing but endure. She had believed in her own inherent goodness, her humanity, and lived accordingly, never causing anyone harm. Her devotion to doing things the right way had been unflagging. All her success had depended on it, and she would have gone on like that indefinitely. She didn't understand why, but faced with those decaying buildings and straggling grasses, she was nothing but a child who had never lived." One of the best things I got from this was just it made me feel a bit on edge and a bit introspective and a little bit creeped out, which I think is means that it was really effective. And from what I can tell, the translation is done well. I think that you can feel the author's voice, but not in an overt way, but more whatever she's trying to do in building this world is communicated really clearly through the translation. I mean, not having read the Korean, so I can't really judge. And then the second thing, besides the tone, is just kind of the conceptual themes. I think I could read this again and unpack other connections. It's a very deliberate book. Everything is put in there for a reason. Every image is there for a reason. And it builds up kind of this repository of ideas and I think those themes are really interesting to think about, and the language and the images, like they're really hard-hitting images that she's able to develop and carry through. Those really speak to those themes that I think she's trying to communicate and convey. I will give this a 4.2 out of 5. I really like reading stuff like this that actually evokes feelings, like it makes me feel some way when I'm reading it. It might have been like a teeny bit too graphic for me, but it was okay. Like it wasn't that bad, but it was a lot heavier than I think I realized, and so definitely a little warning on that if that's something that you might be sensitive to. Oh, the last thing I wanted to mention about that book is actually for my book club, we did book club tie-up with painting club. So we also had like an art jam at my place, and we were all supposed to paint the feelings that the book made us feel or just be inspired by the book. So I thought I would share with you guys my painting that I did. If you read this book, let me know if you think this painting is an accurate reaction or like resonates with you. These are just dried rose petals in case you can't tell. The next book I want to talk about is called The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yoko Ogawa, who I think is a pretty well-known Japanese author. My friend Alyssa lent this to me. She said it was one of her favorite short reads. It is a very slim novel, and I can definitely see what she's talking about. I feel like Ogawa just has such confidence and is just able to, I got really pulled into this very simple but just like very well drawn world. It was just done with like such assuredness that it was really easy to read and really easy to feel connected to the characters. It's about a housekeeper who works for a professor, and the professor is kind of a math genius. He used to be a math professor until he got into a car accident, which left him with a brain injury. So now he only has a memory that lasts 80 minutes. So after 80 minutes, he'll forget whatever has happened. So his short-term memory doesn't work very well. I don't want to give away the plot, but there's not really a really strong storyline, which I actually really appreciated. It just felt so simple and pure. There were no big reveals. Instead, it just felt like the writing was very clear, and the characterization was really well done. I love the character development. And the perspective, the story is told from the point of view of the housekeeper. Her voice is very strong. Her personality is not strong in the sense of like powerful, but strong in the sense of Ogawa really knows like how she wants the character to come across. And then her son and the professor, I think, are sketched out really well, because through the various things that happen and also the little details here and there that you learn about them and how they react in certain situations, you really get a well-rounded and well-developed character, and I started to care a lot about them. One of the best parts of this book is the role of numbers themselves. The math professor, I think even before he had his accident, was socially awkward and really viewed numbers as maybe more dependable and more sturdy than human relationships. And so now that he's had this accident and it's even harder for him to navigate the world, and he's really dependent on other people and the housekeeper for support, you can see how he turns to numbers as a safety net, kind of like a comfort blanket. So throughout the story, he tutors both the housekeeper and her son in math, but also not in a very formal way, but more of a playful way, and just showing his love for math and his pure excitement for these different discoveries and how logical and perfect and powerful numbers can be, especially the properties of certain numbers. And so one of his kind of tics is if he can't remember who someone is and he feels uncomfortable in a situation, he'll ask, "What's your birthday?" Or he'll ask, tell me a number or think of a number. And then he'll figure out a way that that number is special. Either it's a perfect number or it's a prime or there's something interesting about it. And that was also really fun. It just felt really wholesome. It made me miss math class, and it did remind me of how in theory the world is chaotic, but in practice there are all of these relationships and all of these theorems and formulas that just happen to work out perfectly. So actually, now that I think about it, I feel like this is a good 1-2 punch. You should maybe read them together. They should be companion novels, because if you get really freaked out from this one, you can kind of be pulled back into your safe haven through this one. Yeah, so no big aha moments or anything, but just really, really well done. Just very pure and good writing and character development, and also saying something about human relationships and these characters and kind of what we need to feel safe and secure in this world. And I think that that's kind of the overall feeling that I got from reading it. So I would recommend it. It's a short read. For the rating, I will give it a 4.3 out of 5. The last book I want to talk about, I read on my Kindle. I kind of had to force myself to read it. It's called Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste, and I was not a fan. I think this book a lot of people have probably read, so very curious if other people liked it. I read her first book, which is called Everything I Never Told You, and it's way better than this one. And I didn't even like that one very much either. I noticed both that book and this book are set in the recent past or the past, and I don't think it works very well for her as an author. I was thinking about this, and it's very hard for me to say that with authority because I wasn't alive in these time periods that she's describing. I guess Little Fires Everywhere takes place in the 90s, so I was alive, but I wasn't a fully formed human then. But it just doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel authentic. It felt like a heavy-handed depiction of what she thought the world was like then, as opposed to something that felt really real. And just for example, I also didn't live through the Mad Men era, but I think watching that TV show, and even just when it first came out and my dad saw a few episodes, they were able to capture, obviously it's different media, one is visual and one is literary, but that show captured that time period so well that it's part of what really set it up for success, where I feel like both of Celeste's novels that she's written that haven't taken place in the present or modern times just kind of fall flat when it comes to that level of authenticity. The first book, I think, was a really good debut. It was a very good first novel, and I think it wasn't perfect, but maybe it was a little rough around some edges, but I think I had high hopes. And then this book almost just felt like a bit of a different genre. It was really more of the Lovely Bones or Gone Girl type of style, much more dramatic, much more plot driven. You can get into the heads of every character, and there's clear villains and clear heroes. The basic premise is you're following these two families. One family is kind of the Leave It to Beaver, perfect American family, but upgraded a little bit because they live in this very idealistic community called Shaker Heights, where there's racial integration and everyone is liberal but comfortable. And this family has 4 kids, and then the parents, I already forgot their names because I was so over this book, but anyway, the mom, who's the villain, she is renting out one of their properties, and there is a woman named Mia and her daughter Pearl who rent that property from the Dream family. And you don't know where Pearl's father is. Mia is a photographer with kind of a hazy background. Pearl has always kind of been an outsider because she's moved multiple times, because her mom has a very peripatetic life, and a lot of stuff happens. It's very dramatic. I'm not going to spoil it. You can also watch the TV show, which is the whole reason I read it, was so that I could then watch the show, but now I don't even want to watch the show. But anyway, lots of things are revealed. There's lots of, like, I don't know, moments where you're going to gasp as the reader. Not that many plot twists necessarily, but it just felt so heavy-handed. It almost felt soap operatic. Like, you can really feel, it's not like the good type of I can feel the author's voice. It's the bad type of I can feel, like, her mind being like, okay, now I need this to happen, and now this is going to happen, and oh, I bet you didn't think this was going to happen. Yeah, I just feel like it was super over the top and hitting the reader over the head. The prose is pretty clunky. Some of her prose in her first novel is actually very aching and gorgeous. I don't know what happened. I feel like the second novel is just a different genre. It's much more of a beach vacation, airport thriller type of novel, but the ones that are like marketed to a women's demographic. So maybe that's what she was trying to do, and she did get a TV deal out of it. A few quibbles, if you have read it and you know what I'm talking about. I feel like the way adoptive mothers are portrayed in this book is a little bit borderline offensive. One of the key storylines is around mothers giving birth to their own, like, birth children, and how that's a more natural, or I don't know, how that bond never ever breaks, even though there are also adoptive mothers in the story that are actually really good at being a mom. I think someone probably out there has criticized this book for its portrayal of adoptive mothers. There was this really weird undercurrent of the woman who gave birth to the child is the rightful mother, which I was just kind of like, I don't know. I also think her depictions of race are really clunky and heavy-handed. I also thought this about, she in both her novels, she depicts racism against Asian Americans, and in both books, it just didn't land properly. It felt pretty forced. In her first book, she depicts some anti-Asian, like, stereotypes of the father who's Chinese in, like, the 50s or 60s, which kind of felt like textbook examples. It felt kind of forced. And then in this book, she brings up an example of there not being any Asian dolls, just in a very heavy-handed way, I think. There's a whole subplot about a Chinese woman in this idealistic town who gave up her baby, then the baby got adopted by this other family, and now there's, like, a court fight over who the real mother is, or who should have custody of the baby. One thing that is kind of interesting is I saw in the Amazon Prime adaptation of this book, they make Mia and Pearl Black Americans, and Reese Witherspoon plays the mom, and that family is white, and so there is a clear racial dynamic, which I don't think is in the book. Later, I read an interview with Celeste that says she wanted to have that dynamic in the book, but as someone who isn't Black, she didn't feel like she could portray that, which I'm not even going to really touch that. All of the descriptions of the characters don't really hint at that. And honestly, if Celeste Ng wanted them to be Black, but then did this, like, little tiptoeing, skirting around it and just using these, like, vaguer descriptions, that's almost, like, worse. I don't know. But you definitely get the feeling that Mia and Pearl feel a little bit out of place in this community that they're living in. Just didn't really get the point of it, and the mom was so annoying and such a villain, and there was no, like, storytelling in terms of overall pacing or learning things in kind of a natural or interesting way. It was very just heavily plot driven, and I I'm not very good at predicting this type of stuff. I think someone who voraciously reads these types of books would have been able to figure out the plot ahead of time. And the only reason I didn't was because I'm kind of slow. But it's that kind of book, like almost formulaic even, a little bit soapy, and really just driven by the plot and these descriptions that you get from the internal voice of each of the characters. So you always know what they're thinking. There's no like mystery or anything hidden about that. So I think I'm probably going to have to give up on Celeste Ng. Not my cup of tea. And even reading it, this was supposed to be like my easy book, like even easier than just a fiction novel. And I had to read the first page like 6 times. It was just, I didn't feel very hooked by her writing style or her descriptions of things. So that's my opinion. I might be being a little bit harsh, so don't let it deter you too much. It's a very easy read. Maybe like getting annoyed at the characters and wanting to know what happens next is something that will hook you. Definitely let me know if you've read this and loved it, because I'm very easily influenced and I might be able to change my mind, but I'm not going to, I don't think, because this was kind of a disappointment and a letdown. It wasn't as bad as End of October, which is, I think, the lowest scoring book that I've ever reviewed, which I probably gave a 1 out of 5. I'll give it like a 2.5 out of 5. And I'll say the same thing I said for that book too, which is I'm not against this genre, but I think even for this genre of kind of like thriller, mystery, sensationalized writing, there are better books out there than this. Oh, and if you're a longtime viewer, acknowledging I've only made like 5 videos, you may remember that I'm trying to read 1 book a month about Singapore, and you might be wondering what was the month of September, but I was over ambitious and this was my book and I did not finish it, so it'll be in the next month's video. It is 500 pages, 400 pages, it's 400 pages. It's actually not that long. There's like 20 pages of pictures, but it's super detailed. It's a super detailed account of the opposition in Singapore. I find it fascinating. I'm like totally nerding out. I'm not sure how many other people are going to find it fascinating, so I probably won't talk about it too much in depth in next month's video, but it really is a must read. Which I say about all my Singapore books. But if you're interested at all in Singapore and understanding how the government works and how politics work, you have to know about the opposition. And it was basically these 2 guys, J.B. Jeyaretnam and Chiam Si Tong, who are so cute in this little picture here, who just paved the way. And it's really incredible how so much of that history can boil down to 2 singular individuals. But anyway, no spoilers. I won't get ahead of myself, but that will be the book that I talk about next month. But I'll also start another Singapore book, so maybe there will be 2. Anyway, thanks for watching. Really appreciate all the support, even if you haven't watched, which then you wouldn't hear this, but any comments and just people telling me that they're excited for my YouTube channel has really meant a lot. So thanks for watching this one and sticking it out this far, and I'll see you in next month's video.